Welcome to the Everyday Ministry Podcast, where ministers get together to discuss everyday ministry.
This is James.
And I'm Corey.
We're sitting here with John and Joe from York, Nebraska, and excited to have them on here. We're going to talk about ministry and podcasting and whatever else comes to mind.
So fun things.
That's right. So, John, if you would just take the opportunity to introduce yourself.
First, thanks for having us on. We appreciate you guys taking the time to invite us to be on your podcast. I'm John Hawkins. I'm pastor for Preaching and Vision at Arbor Drive Community Church in York, Nebraska. Been here 4 years, going into my fifth year of ministry here. I am married and have two little girls. One is just over 2 and one is turning 6 months here pretty soon. So our house is full of all sorts of excitement and noise and awesomeness. So I love it. It's great. So I've been a believer for, I came to Christ when I was like 22. So it's been like 12 years, 10 years, something like that. And I actually came to faith because of kidney failure. So I had kidney failure and had to get a kidney transplant. And I was in the hospital recovering on my own after everybody had left, and opened up a Bible and turned to Romans and started reading Romans. And by the time I got to Romans 5:8, I was convicted of my need for Christ and repented and trusted in Him. And so it's been kind of a crazy ride ever since. Seeing God's grace and faithfulness in my life. So I've been, like I said, I've been here at Arbor Drive for about just 4 years now. And I came to Arbor Drive from a small church in Missouri, at the Summit Church in Rogersville, Missouri. And my wife and I had moved there so she could go to physical therapy school. And God led us to this fantastic little church, and just had a lot of men that got involved in our lives, in my life as a believer. It helped me grow in my faith and my understanding of the gospel and my love for Christ. And God just sort of used that and used them and some various circumstances to call me to ministry. And so talked to the elders there about it, and they're like, all right, let's see if this is where God's leading. Started giving me opportunities to teach and preach, started meeting with me and just discipling me. And so was there for 3 years doing that. And while I was doing that, while I was serving in local church, went to seminary at Southern Seminary in Louisville, and graduated, came up here, been enjoying ministry up here. It's first full-time ministry position, first senior preaching pastor position. My third sermon was my candidating sermon. So the expectations were not very high when when I got up here. So there was nowhere really to go but up. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
Very great thing.
Man, I understand that. Me and Corey, we've been in ministry about the same time period, and I became a senior pastor about 3.5 years ago, and I don't even want to hear a sermon from then. So,
Joe and I were just talking about it. We went back on YouTube and we're watching some of the earlier sermons, and I was like, man, this is just painful. Yeah. I can't believe they kept me around here.
I think I've said this on here before, but I remember I did youth ministry for my first thing in ministry, and I did that and then got my bachelor's in pastoral ministry. And when I first started getting my bachelor's, I really found out how to read the Bible in a good way and how to study it hermeneutically. That was a year in ministry, and I don't even want to think about that first year. So it had to have been rough. But anyhow, God's grace is abounds in all things.
That's true.
Right? So do you have any hobbies other than the podcast you're starting?
Well, I like to I've sort of got I don't know. I do a lot of different stuff. I dabble. I tend to get into things and try them out. I like experiencing new stuff. So I like going out, and regular things are going out shooting. I like being outdoors, camping, backpacking, stuff like that. I enjoy spending time with my kids and doing stuff with them. Spending time with my wife. We go to movies together. That's kind of our thing. And then also chess. Like I've gotten into chess again recently. My dad taught me to play when I was a little kid, and I was over in Romania with an organization called Training Leaders International, training pastors over there, and ran across a Romanian chess set and brought it back, and have been trying to find opponents to to play chess. So yeah, those are hobbies for me.
Well, if you download Chess with Friends, I'll play with you. But it'll be a long game to play with you from Alabama to Nebraska.
Joe, if you would now just kind of introduce yourself as well. Tell us a little bit about your ministry position, your family, your education, those types of things. Please,
Yeah,
sir.
sure. Well, like John said, I appreciate you guys having us on. It's awesome to get to talk to you. So I'm the pastor for worship and outreach here at Arbor Drive in York. Been here in ministry. I'm in my third year, so we're about 2.5 years into where I served as the music minister before that here for 1.5 years, and then moved into a pastoral role. I'm married. We've been married 11 years to my wife, Michaela, and we have 3 kids. We have 2 girls and a boy. Our Ashlyn's 8 and Kaylee's 6, and we had just gotten out of toddler stage, and then along came our little boy Ian. He's 6 months, so we're kind of getting used to having to reproof the house for little babies that crawl around and chew on everything. So, but that's exciting, and he's been a blessing to us. So, no, I'm not formally educated. The process of my education was just men pouring into me. There was about 10 years ago, I got into ministry, also started in youth, just sponsoring senior hires. And a friend of mine came along that we're still friends with. He was a pastor here, and he just pushed me to start leading music for our youth group, and it grew real big. And eventually I felt the call to ministry, and that was affirmed again and again by God through various people. And then John moved up here, and it was really funny. The very first time he came here for his candidating sermon, he was doing a Q&A during our Sunday school hour in the worship center. And he had said something pretty much to the effect that he doesn't plan to go anywhere. He wants to be somewhere and stay there for 30 years. And he made a statement that made it sound like, I don't care what happens, I'm never leaving, which as I've gotten to know him, I think that is true. But I said something to him. I was like, man, that's a pretty bold statement. I mean, God can move you anytime and anywhere. And he's like, yeah, but I think this is where God's called me, and and so we had butted heads right away, and we had this obnoxious friend. His name is Gabe, and he was a big loudmouth. He doesn't live here anymore, but he got us in a room together, and we started talking. And like, we're so opposite, and yet our relationship it's worked out really well for us as people, but also for our church as well. So it's been an exciting time the last 2 years here for me personally.
Awesome. Are there any hobbies you want us to know about, or anything else you want to tell the listeners?
I used to be an avid golfer. I used to golf a ton. I still enjoy doing that, but it used to be competitive and play lots of tournaments, and now it's more just recreational. And so I do that. I really love spending time with my kids and my wife. We play lots of games, card games at home. I grew up playing card games, and so my wife got used to that as we've been married, and now our kids really enjoy it. So spend lots of time with them. And I really enjoy music. I get to do it here at church, but I also just dabble on my own time, messing around, trying to learn new things. So
What is your favorite card game of choice, if I may ask?
man, that's hard. I really like spades.
Okay.
Spades, pitch, hearts. I've played all of those, and I'm always learning new ones too. So
I'll tell you a really good one that I learned from our other host that couldn't be with us, Daniel. I played it with him last year, Dutch Blitz. It is
Dutch
awesome.
Blitz. So I've never played that one, but I've heard a
It's
lot of
awesome.
people that say it's fun. So I'll have to try that one.
You have to have certain cards you get from like Barnes and Noble or something, but if you get it, it's the bomb.
Good game. All right, sounds good. We'll try it out.
Rook is where it's at.
That's what
I
I'm
do
saying.
like Rook. We have a Rook game too. That's a fun game as well.
My wife played Rook the first time she ever played Rook. She played with two friends of ours, and I can't remember whether I was teamed up with the husband or the wife. At any rate, we just demolished them. I mean, it was ugly. It was brutal. And she to this day will not play that game. I think I ruined her on it.
So no chivalry there, right?
Yeah, right. When you get into a card game, all of that goes out the window, man.
That's right.
Trash talk comes out. You
Exactly.
might be in the doghouse for the next week, but if you win, it's worth it.
That's right. My wife doesn't play card games, so I don't know what that's like. I have to force her to play when we have a group come over. So, but that's awesome, guys. Love hearing where y'all have come from in your lives and how you've made yourself in ministry. But one thing y'all have coming up is the podcast release on the 16th of January. So what made y'all start the podcast and kind of what's your goal with that?
So this sort of came about
Extremely quickly.
it sort of did. Like it kind of, we decided to do it, and my personality is once we decide to do something, let's do it. So it's been fast and furious since we decided to do it, but I've been thinking about it for a while. So we have a group of guys that get together once a week, and we'll sit down and we'll hang out and talk about what's going on in our homes, what's going on in our families, different hobbies, different just life stuff. But then inevitably the conversation always turns to something about the Bible, something about a sermon, something that we've been studying, reading, thinking about. And we end up having these really long, interesting conversations where we're challenging one another, helping one another grow. So we've been doing that for, I guess, 4 years. They were doing it before I got here, and thankfully they invited me into that when I got here. And so I've been doing this with them for 4 years. And at one point, somebody said, "Man, I wish other people could sit in on this. I wish that they could be a part of this. I wish that they could hear these discussions." So that happened, and I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about, yeah, that's a really good idea. I wonder how we can make that happen, and then couple that with where we're at as a church right now. We're not a small church anymore, but we're not a large church. We're in this intermediate, medium-sized church stage, and we're going through the process of learning what it is to be a church this size, learning how to understand that it's okay to not know everybody in the church, to not be best friends with everybody at the church. But at the same time, from a leadership standpoint, there's additional challenges to growth. And one of them is, how do we disciple people? How do we, outside of the Sunday morning service, outside of Wednesday evening youth, how do we help people engage with the word? How do we disciple and equip people to grow in their walk with Christ in everyday circumstances? I don't have the time to be able to meet with everybody in the church like I would like to. And so I started asking myself, what are some ways that we can leverage technology to be able to provide some content that's mobile, that's portable, that people can access around their schedule, and that's widely available, even beyond the people in Arbor Drive. And so podcasting sort of came up as an idea with that. So that's sort of how it kind of started. And once we decided to do it, I've been sort of just running 100 miles an hour, just going with it. So
John's like been a really big part on my growth as a pastor, as a music minister, and walked me through a lot of things. And yet we still have a pretty unique friendship in that as well. And a lot of people think of discipleship in a really formal setting. It's a formal disciple or disciplee type of relationship. And while it is that, as the disciplee grows, you grow into this relationship. And so we wanted to let people see, at least in some parts, some of what we're going to do is just let them in on our relationship and see how that started and how it's blossomed and what it is now, and how we continue to sharpen each other and continue to grow each other. And we just want people to be, hey, it's not a formal thing. It's just get together with a guy, and if you're immerse yourself in what God wants you to be immersed in, and be Christ-centered, and if he's your treasure, then those things come out in just normal conversations. And and they do with us quite a bit. And we just want people to see that.
Yeah, and there's another aspect too that sort of led us to start this, and that is, I think that I know this was true for me. I'll just speak from my own personal experience. When we lived in Missouri, I didn't know what it looked like to have gospel-centered, Christ-centered, faith-driven discussions with other people in a way that wasn't cheesy or corny or stupid or forced. Like it's like you sit down with somebody, and I've always felt like those types of conversations were kind of like an interrogation, or it was just, I don't really want to talk about this, but I'm supposed to talk about this. So, and so I didn't understand how that looked until some men from that church just started involving me in their lives and would invite me over to their house, and we'd have dinner together, and the conversation would inevitably turn to something of eternal significance. And it was never forced. It was never awkward. It was never cheesy or corny or dumb. It was a natural thing. And so for one of the aims is just to be able to have these types of conversations and give people that might feel uncomfortable in those, or like they don't know how to have those, or like they don't know enough to be able to participate in one of those conversations, give them a resource and a tool that they can listen to and be involved in that conversation, and think about that, talk about that with their friends, talk about that with their family, talk about that with their kids. We want this to be something where a mom and a dad can listen to it and then come together and talk about it, and how those things that we talk about are going to play out in their lives or in their family. Be able to have, parents with their kids sit down and maybe listen to it and have a discussion about it, or the parents bring that up with their kids and have that discussion with their kids. Just want to be able to help equip people to be able to have those discussions, to be able to sharpen one another and challenge one another and help one another grow.
Sounds pretty awesome. I'm excited to hear what y'all are going to be doing when you get started and kind of how it goes for y'all. You telling us how you got started, me and John, maybe a lot alike, because me and Corey talked about doing a podcast, and I think it wasn't but a week later I had a website built and I had a interface and all that, so I think I can relate to that. But that's awesome. I'm excited to see what's going to come of the podcast, and just hopefully later on we can talk and see how it's impacted the church as well, and made a difference for the kingdom in that sense.
Absolutely.
Corey, you got anything you want to talk about the podcast?
I just know that, I think that you see a lot of people coming out with podcasts today. I heard a guy say one time that what people do a lot of times is, they'll start their own thing. And a guy said, how come everybody starts their own thing? But I think that podcasts are like one of you guys said, is a very good avenue to open up, because you have so many different people with different walks of life. And, like we all four of us have walked different walks of life, and that's good. And we can give different perspectives on things. And obviously all four of our ministries are different from one another. Any type of ministry podcast is very encouraging. So, man, y'all just go for it. Just do as best as you can in the Lord's will with it. And, man, just, yeah. I mean, it sounds like you guys are already on the ground with it and running. But
I am. I'm dragging him along with me.
Yeah.
We need more and more podcasts out there like this. So.
Well, and one of the things that I've been listening to different Christian podcasts, and one of the things that I wrestle with is this even worthwhile? Is this necessary? And so two things on that. The first one is we're primarily seeing this first and foremost as a ministry within our local context. So this is not necessarily something where we have any expectation that this is going to be utilized or listened to beyond the people in our congregation. And even to be realistic, I mean, maybe just some people in the congregation, but we want to provide it as a resource for the people that we're responsible for as shepherds, as a shepherding tool. So that's number one. But then number two, the other thing I was thinking about is, as I've been listening to these different Christian podcasts, and I love a lot of them. I enjoy listening to them. A lot of them center around either two guys having a discussion by themselves, or interviewing somebody that's popular in ministry, or an expert in a certain area of ministry, or they're focused on one topic or one sort of niche within Christianity. Like there are 1689 federalism podcasts, there are New Covenant theology podcasts, there are a dispensational podcast, there, whatever it is. And one of the things that we're aiming to do with this is not fall into a niche, but have a broad focus. Because when Christ saves us, the area of our life that's impacted by Christ, or the area of our lives that we struggle in, don't fall into narrow categories. And so we want to have members from our church. In fact, our second episode is going to be a member from our church, just sitting down and talking a little bit about their faith and where they came from and how God's been faithful in their life, as just an encouragement to other people that might be going through similar situations. So sharing stories, bringing other pastors into the conversation and having conversations and getting other perspectives from other pastors that are going to help our people better understand and better apply the word of God and the gospel in their lives. And then, just the two of us sitting down and talking about whatever happens to be on the plate and having a discussion like that. So as I was looking at it, it's a little bit different idea from what I've listened to, because it isn't, as narrow or as focused or as have a certain format that's tied to.
Yeah. There's a shepherding aspect to this as well. I think as we do grow, and as we have grown in the last couple of years, I think as people listen to this and they hear us having conversations, that unapproachability that we might have on a Sunday morning, that for whatever reason, I've been told many times I have buzz off written on my head. And so if people help people see that other side, that we do genuinely care for the things of God. We genuinely care for the flock here, and we want to help. And I think this is going to help us to shepherd, as we've been struggling with that, with a small amount of guys that are trying to shepherd a fairly large flock for the number that are shepherds. So I think this will help in that too.
Yeah.
That's what I love about what y'all are doing, because your main focus is your congregation. And if other people may hear it, that's fine. I wish I could have done something like that, but half of my congregation in Vernon, Alabama don't know what podcasts are. So, and they won't ever hear this. So they won't say nothing.
One of the cool things that you guys mentioned was that it's not, a lot of podcasts have these big name celebrity guys. Not celebrity, in the Christian world. And one of our early episodes, if I recall, we talked about, what about those ministers, those preachers, those youth pastors that are like on those in the backwoods that nobody's ever going to hear from, but they serve faithfully and they have a lot of cool things to say.
Yeah.
And, they serve the Lord as best as they can. And, I think podcasts should try to incorporate those types of people, like you guys said.
Absolutely.
More and more, because, man, there's awesome people for the Lord out there everywhere. So I like that. That was a good point.
Paul, I think it was Paul Washer, was asked who the best Christian preacher is that he knew, or who the best Christian preacher was that was alive. And he said, you don't know who he is. He's some missionary that's slugging it out in the jungle day in and day out, that's ministering and being faithful, and nobody's ever going to hear his sermons. Nobody's ever going to hear beyond the people that he's preaching to and ministering to. Nobody's ever going to hear about him, but he's going to be great in the kingdom of heaven because of his faithfulness. And we're in a rural setting. York is 9,000 people, so compared to some of the towns around here, it's fairly large, but we're not in Minneapolis. We're not in New York City. We're not in Atlanta. We're a rural church, and there are challenges that rural churches face that city churches or churches in larger urban populations don't face. And so being able to talk to some of those pastors from other rural settings and be able to encourage them, and then be a resource for maybe some other pastors or other church members in smaller rural churches to be able to use our podcast to encourage them or to help them work through an issue that they're facing that's unique to that type of context. So that's sort of another thing that we've been talking about as we've been going through this.
I can relate to a lot of that. I think Corey can as well. Just kind of a lot of it's why we started ours, but trying to reach the ones over here in Alabama. But that's enough about podcast life. This is called the Everyday Ministry Podcast, so we want to talk about ministry a little bit. And I'm going to ask you this question, John, and it's not on your paper, so you're going to be surprised. And Joe, you're going to be asked this as well, but you got a little time to think about it.
This is why it's good to be the sidekick.
That's right. That's right. One thing we ask always on this podcast, and for whatever reason I did not put it on your paper, is how would you define an everyday ministry?
How would I define an everyday ministry? So Ephesians chapter 4, the church has been given apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And so ministry is something that is not limited to pastors, not limited to missionaries. Ministry is something that every Christian should be doing. And when we think about ministry and what ministry should look like, we have to look to guys like Christ and Paul, Peter. And for them, it was just living out their relationship with God, living in a way where God was at the center and the focal point of everything that they did, and living as heralds of the good news of Jesus Christ and being willing to put legs to that. You know, not just say, I believe this or I care about my neighbor, but actually demonstrate that in genuine acts of love that flow from rejoicing and worshiping because of what God has done for us in Christ and the way he has served us. So I guess that's sort of everyday ministry, is living out your relationship with Christ in a way that puts the gospel on display and loves your neighbor and shows the supremacy of Christ in your life.
Can't agree more. So John, tell us a little bit about your role as the pastor at Arbor Drive, and then just tell us anything you want us to know about that.
So when I got here, I was the only pastor here, the only staff pastor here. And so I functioned like that for 2.5 years. Yeah. And we've since gotten to a point where we have Joe as the pastor for worship and outreach. And then Jonathan Clemens is our pastor for family ministry. So we've been able to cross level some of the responsibilities. So my primary responsibilities right now are preaching, teaching, overseeing adult education, and doing leadership development, investing in men that God's calling to eldership and men that God's calling to ministry outside of our church, that he wants to use us as a church to help equip them.
Well, tell us a little bit about the demographics of your church, about what y'all run in attendance, and then is everybody on staff full time or bivocational? What's all that look like?
Yeah, so Joe was bivocational right up until the beginning of this last year.
August
of this last year. And he came on full-time August of 2017. Jonathan was hired 2016, yeah. He was hired 2016 full-time. So our church demographics, thankfully, we have a multi-generational church. When I came here, there were not a lot of families or people coming that were my age or below. And that's changed over the last 4 years. So we've got a ton of
we're pretty heavy in young families now.
Yeah, we've got kids being born out the wazoo.
All the staff pastors had kids this year.
Yeah, and all of us had kids within a month of one another. So we've got our demographic has shifted over the last 4 years. We have, I think, a lot more balance in the generations, and so we have a multi-generational congregation. Over the last 2 years, in particular, we've had some pretty significant ministry opportunities at a local mission, and so we've had the to minister to some people that are hurting pretty bad and that have had some challenges in their life. And so our demographic has shifted. We're no longer a upper middle class only church, and that's been kind of our goal. Is we want the church to reflect the community. We want the demographic of the church to reflect the demographic of the area that we live. So yeah,
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then Corey will move to Joe. If you could provide just one word of encouragement or advice to pastors out there that are preaching regularly, what would it be?
I would say that all of the examples that we see of faithful ministers that were used by God in tremendous ways, all of those examples are accompanied by suffering and sorrow and loneliness and opposition. So don't be discouraged when those things come. Like Peter says, don't be surprised when the fiery trial comes upon you as though some strange thing has happened. Like we tend to look at opposition, or we tend to look at discouragement or different things that happen in ministry and be like, what? I did everything right, or I'm trying to do everything right. But there's a lot of times when we can look at all of the negative stuff and miss the really cool things that God is doing. And he's just been teaching me that over the last 2 years. There's faithful men who day in and day out are ministering to the people of God, caring for the people of God, preaching the word faithfully, might not see in this life the impact that it has, but their reward will be great in heaven. And so have an eternal perspective and don't get discouraged by circumstance. We can rejoice in Christ in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our sorrow, because we're suffering for Christ and for the sake of his name. And so don't reject it. Don't run away from it. Embrace it as God's sanctifying work, and humble yourself and just keep plugging. Just keep going.
Awesome. All right, Mr. Joe, now you tell us, please, about your role as a worship pastor. And you said also outreach, right?
Yep. I oversee
outreach. All right. Take it away, sir.
Okay. Well, like I said earlier, I'm the pastor for worship and outreach. I lead and oversee our music ministry here at Arbor Drive, not just on Sunday morning, but anything that would go on with music. I'm also overseeing our outreach ministry, our discipleship community, which is our small group ministry. I'm overseeing that now, and I'm the organizer of the 3 staff guys. So I've kind of overtaken the communication and admin responsibilities, not as in doing them, but just making sure that they get done. Like, I'm not super tech savvy, which is odd for a worship pastor to not be tech savvy, but I'm not. John's probably the most tech savvy of us all, which is why I'm being drug along in this thing. But I'm happy to be here. It's pretty awesome. So those are kind of my roles here.
You guys small groups look like? How often do you guys meet? Weekly, on Sundays, or?
Sure. So our church we've got about 400 people that regularly attend, but our regular attendance is probably half. So we got about 250 that come a Sunday, and we've got 6 groups going right now. They have about 12 people in them, and there's a leader in each group. So my goal is generally to meet with the leaders and see how their groups are doing, and helping those guys move their group towards our overall goal for each of those groups. They meet twice a month. We meet on the 2nd and 4th Sunday evenings for the most part. There's a couple groups that do some different things, but that's what that looks like. And they most of them are either they're reviewing the sermon from that Sunday and just talking more in depth about it, or their leaders having them study something themselves and they're talking about that. So
on the way y'all doing it every other week like that, I'm just curious, because we're looking at doing something very similar to my church starting in March. Does it seem to work well doing it twice a month rather than every week? Or
well, I can't speak for your context, but for our context, we live in a community that is extremely busy.
Yeah.
And everybody does a ton of things. So we're trying to still minister to the people, but not be overwhelming to them. And I think it's worked really well. Like, I can speak for the group that I'm in. Like, most everybody in our group is committed. Yeah. And they're there every time we meet. They know it's the 2nd and 4th Sunday, so they can put it in their calendar and know it's coming. I think it's worked. I think it's worked well. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it also it provides some longevity, because we typically will eat together.
Yeah.
And if you're hosting it, if you agree to host it for a year and have people in your home 52 Sundays a year or 50 Sundays a year and coordinate food and all of that can be overwhelming. So we want it to be a positive fellowship experience, not be something that people dread.
I was just curious because, like, my church context is we're a very simple church. We have Sunday morning worship and Wednesday night Bible study. And so we wanted to do something a little different, but I didn't want to overwork or burden the people. So that's why we're looking at doing it twice a month. And they are busy lives as well. And so that's why I was kind of curious of how it went off for y'all. Obviously, completely different context, but most people do it every week or they do it in semester. And so I was just curious.
Yeah, I think the way we were consistent in what we said we were going to do, and so every time we communicated it, they heard the same thing over and over when we got it started, and that's continued. So I think that helps too.
Yeah,
just being consistent in how you communicate it. So.
Okay.
And Simple's good,
kind of
man. Simple's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of a side question here. You guys said you do sermon-based small groups. Is that right?
Some of the groups do. I think
Based off
most
the
everybody
sermon?
was for a while. I still think we've got some groups doing that. Yeah.
I've just heard that is that's one of the most effective ways to do a small group. That seemed to be pretty.
If you don't have people that want to go and do extra study, like they come and they sit and somebody's walked them through the text and they probably had some questions or some thoughts. So you can go more in depth on maybe something that John hadn't covered that morning, or whoever was preaching that morning.
Right.
And when my groups do, we're working through our way through the book of Colossians, but we did sermon based for a while, and it was effective. Like people had good questions, and you could tell they were thinking. So,
well, I think it also depends on the group of people too.
Yeah.
There are some groups where it's just better to walk them through Genesis so they can learn the meta narrative of the Bible, and they can learn how to read a narrative text.
Right.
And so it kind of depends. And the other thing is, if you do sermons like we do, we've spent how long in Romans?
Well, we started last January.
Yeah, I think
we got through chapter 4.
Yeah, we're starting Romans chapter 5 this year. So Romans is going to be like a 5-year expedition. And so sometimes having those small groups, it's good to take a break from that and give them some other stuff in the Bible. So yeah.
Nice. Joe, you said you haven't had any formal education, like you haven't been to seminary or anything like that.
Right. Yep.
And I just want to touch, I'm 6 years into youth ministry, and I'm on my way to going to seminary, but I'm not there myself either. But I just want our listeners to realize, obviously, if you're listening, I'm just now meeting Joe, but Joe seems like a very wise guy, and he seems like he's had he's been in the Word, and God's working on him. And what I want to say from that is the old saying is that seminaries don't make the preachers, God makes the preachers. So any of our listeners who may be struggling and saying, well, I haven't been to seminary, so am I really being that effective in my ministry? Seminary is a great avenue, and I would say if you have the ability and you have the ways to make it work, go for it. But don't just credit seminary as being this is what equips me and this is what gets me there. So other thing I wanted to ask you, Joe, real quick, no problem, man. The other thing I wanted to ask you was if you could say one thing to any worship pastor, and since John got to go first, the pressure's on for your answer. But anyway, if you could say one thing to any worship pastor maybe coming up or worship pastor now, just to encourage them, what would you say to?
Worship pastors are kind of a unique group of people. So
Absolutely.
my encouragement to them would be to remember that you're a pastor. And you're a pastor first and a musician second. A lot of guys, I've been talking to John. We're in a rural context, so there's not many bigger churches around here. So there's not a lot of worship pastors around here. So I had gotten involved in a Facebook page, and I was just on there, and nobody talks about scripture. Nobody talks about theology. It's all about music, and I'm not saying those things aren't important, because I think music is very important. And if we had another 2 hours, we could talk a lot about the role of music in the Christian's life. But be a theologian, man. Remember that you're a pastor, and you've got to bring that to the worship service. You've got to know scripture. You've got to know who God is, and because when the Spirit leads you and He's asking you to do something, you got to know scripture if you're going to be able to follow that. Otherwise, you get lost up there. So my encouragement to anybody who's a music minister, or just a worship leader. Maybe you're a lay guy who just leads music. Be a theologian. Get in the Word. Study the Psalms. Study Christ. Know that you are shepherding people as you lead.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
and own that.
Well,
Nice.
Joe, we might have to have you back on here in a few episodes and talk about worship ministry, because that's coming up in about 2 months for us. So
Nice.
we may be contacting you.
All right, sounds good.
One thing I do have to ask you, since you're a worship pastor, and then we're going to move on. I got to know, and this is going to be this is going to shape what I think of you. On how he loves us. Are you a sloppy wet or are you unforeseen?
We don't sing that song. So.
Well, if you had to sing it.
So when I was in youth ministry and before I got smart, we did sing that song, and we did not do sloppy wet. We did unforeseen kiss, I think. So
The real question is, fog machine or no fog machine?
Oh, goodness. I think we need to save these for worship.
Or skinny jeans or no skinny jeans?
Oh, no.
if you had my thighs, you wouldn't even ask that question. So definitely no skinny
Oh,
jeans.
Well, guys, we as we get ready to wrap up here, we always do a plug of the week, and basically just your opportunity to kind of advertise for maybe a book that you would encourage people to pick up, maybe another podcast, it may be some type of Devo book. I mean, anything like that. And so if you guys could just maybe share some type of plug of the week that you might have.
What have I
Do you
been
need
reading?
to think?
What's that?
Do you need to think?
I need to think for a minute. You go ahead.
All right. So I've got a
Okay.
couple of things for the worship pastors out there. A lot of guys are using Hillsong, and they're using Elevation Worship or North Point Worship. I would encourage them to get in, to dig a little deeper and go find some resources that have some songs that their lyrics have some depth and some breadth to them, and they're tied to Scripture. Check out Sovereign Grace Music. That's Bob Coughlin's site. They're really good. They have a lot of resources.
They release it all for free.
Yeah, they do. And you can get chord sheets, you can get lead sheets, you can get anything you need for free. It's all right there. And then the other thing, a lot of guys are afraid to do old songs. And so I personally don't like old songs. Like that's been my personal preference. And when I first came into on here, John gave me a lot of leeway to do some bad songs until I learned on my own. And I would say don't be afraid to take the old songs, the old hymns that have great lyrical content that maybe you don't like musically, and rework them, keep the melody, but make them, update them, modernize them, and use those, because they're a great resource for our churches. And it's a shame that we've got so many bigger churches that are going away from those things.
Yeah.
And then just a book for anybody. True Worshipers is really good. I just gave that to all of our worship team and our AV team. So True Worshipers by Bob Coughlin.
He's giving that thing away like it's on
It's
fire.
a great book for anybody. It's not just worship pastors. So.
We'll just go ahead and send one. No, I'm playing.
Yeah. Yeah. My address is.
I guess I read a book recently by Tim Keller on prayer that was fantastic. Really, really good book. Challenged me in a lot of different ways.
Do you remember what it's called?
Yeah, it's called Prayer.
It's called prayer, right? Yeah, that's what I thought.
You said a good book on prayer. I was like,
yeah,
okay.
it's called
I'm
Prayer.
gonna
by
figure
Tim
that
Keller.
I've got
If you
the same
Google
thing,
Tim
so-
Keller Prayer, it'll come up. So yeah, it was a fantastic resource. And then How to Serve Your Church Through Prayer Ministry is another one I read recently, which is really good. And then for any pastors out there, I would recommend Lectures to My Students by Spurgeon and The Reformed Pastor as regular or annual reading. Both are fantastic resources.
You got any resources for guys who are trying to revitalize that you would recommend?
Yeah. So if you're in a church that's really struggling, or where you're a church revitalizing pastor, the Trellis on the Vine is really good. Revitalize by Resurgence Press. I think Resurgence put that out. That's a really good one. 9 Marks has a ton of amazing resources, and they're all pretty much free online. 9 Marks fan there. Yeah, I love their
Yes,
website.
absolutely.
9 Marks of a Healthy Church, obviously by Mark Dever, is a fantastic book. Yeah, there's a lot more resources on church revitalization than there used to be. But just find a pastor and spend some time with a faithful pastor. Read, but also spend time with other faithful guys. Those guys are going to be able to encourage you and give you advice that books can't. So,
Man, yeah, we love 9 Marks. I'm just telling you. But if you didn't notice, you guys already are kind of getting in the podcast mode there, because Joe just asked John that last question. He said, tell us about some books that you might know. Man, just jumping into it. But I actually, I've got to plug myself. I'm reading this book right now called Growing Up. I'll show it to you guys. Listeners obviously can't see it, but it's called, well, y'all can't see it. There you go. It's called Growing Up. It's by Robbie Gallaty. I can never say his name, but it's just how to make disciples. And I've read a lot of disciple-making books, and man, I'm just telling you, it's the bomb. It's a good thing. Shows you how to set up disciple groups. They have all kind of material at the back of the book to give to your groups and stuff. It's really good. So, Growing Up by Robert Gallaty. I'm not sure. If you're a discipleship maybe pastor out there, or outreach or evangelism, that might be a good source to get a hold of.
I have 2. My first one, since Corey's going to talk about Rob Gallaty, if you're catching this late, you can still jump in. It's Foundations by Rob and Candy Gallaty. It's a 260-day Bible reading plan. It's really, really good so far. And then also, since we talked about worship a little bit, one book I was going to recommend, and I'm curious if John's ever read it. It's called Christ-Centered Worship by Brian Chappell. Have you ever read that one?
I've not read that one.
It's a fantastic book. It begins by telling us the history of how the church has done worship services since it's began. It kind of helps us lay it out in a different way and understand why we do church the way we do, why we do worship services the way we do. Fantastic book. I would encourage anybody to read that. All of these things will be in the show notes. If you're listening, you probably already know that. And then the last plug I want to give is Pastor Discussion Podcast. And as we get ready to close out, do one of y'all want to tell us how they can find that on the 16th?
yeah, so you can go on to iTunes. We've got a feed up. We've put a couple of updates, and we're going to put some promotion stuff up, but you can subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker. We're working on getting a YouTube channel up, and then you can go to pastordiscussions.com for updates and to sign up for the mailing list. You can subscribe through there. There's links to everything. We've got a blog that Jonathan, I think, is planning on. Jonathan, our family ministry pastor, is planning on writing some stuff. So there's a blog there. You can also go on to Facebook and join the pastor, or like the Pastor Discussions podcast page. And yeah, that's how you can connect with us. You can also email pastordiscussions@gmail.com.
Okay. Awesome, guys. I'll get off of here. Sorry it went so long, but I think we had a good conversation about podcasting, ministry, awesome, and everything else.
Appreciate you guys having us.
Oh, man, I'm so glad to have y'all on here. Everybody listening, go check out this podcast. Excited about what God's going to do through it at their local church, but also for those that may be listening from all over the world. But this has been the Everyday Ministry Podcast, and we're a podcast where everyday ministers get together to discuss ministry.
If you're encouraged by what you hear, please go like our Facebook page, share the episodes, and rate the podcast on iTunes. Don't forget that a new episode drops every first and third Mondays. Our prayer is that these episodes are an encouragement to you and that you would be faithful in the ministry that God has placed you in.
Lead to you, slipping off on one need our power.